The dust had barely settled from the stagecoach robbery when Catherine Talmadge realized she had lost everything she owned in the world. And it was that very loss, standing in the middle of a sun-scorched Kansas road in the autumn of 1878, that brought David Wilcox riding toward her like an answer to a prayer she had not yet spoken. She had been traveling from Baltimore to the small cattle town of Willow Creek, Kansas, to claim an inheritance from an uncle she barely remembered, a modest parcel of land that was supposed to be her fresh start after her father's business had collapsed and taken the family fortune with it. The stagecoach had been set upon by 3 masked riders just outside a stand of cottonwoods, and though no one had been hurt, every trunk, every satchel, every last coin she carried had been taken. The driver, an older man named Hobbs, had managed to calm the horses and get them moving again, but Catherine had insisted on stepping down to search the roadside for a locket that had fallen from her bag during the chaos, a small silver piece with her late mother's portrait inside it, the only thing of true value she had left in the world that no bandit could have wanted. It was while she knelt in the dirt, fingers raking through dry grass, that she heard the approach of a horse, and she looked up to see a man she did not know, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, a rifle resting easy across his thighs, the way a man carries something he hopes he will not need but knows how to use all the same. "Ma'am," he said, drawing his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "You are a fair piece from town to be walking these roads alone." "I am not walking," Catherine said, standing and brushing the dust from her skirt with more dignity than her circumstances warranted. "I am searching for something I lost, and the stagecoach is waiting just up the bend." "I heard there was trouble on this road not an hour past," the man said, swinging down from his horse with an ease that suggested he had done it 10,000 times before. "Folks in town are saying 3 men held up the noon coach." "Then folks in town are saying the truth," Catherine replied, and despite herself, despite the fear that still trembled somewhere beneath her ribs, she felt a flash of dry humor rise up in her voice. "I don't suppose you are one of the 3 men, come back to finish the job." The man laughed, a genuine sound, warm and low, and he swept his hat back from his head to reveal sandy brown hair damp with sweat, and a face that was not handsome in the way of magazine illustrations, but was honest in a way that Catherine found she trusted almost against her will. "No, ma'am. Name's David Wilcox. I run a ranch about 6 miles west of Willow Creek. I was headed into town for supplies when I heard the shots." "Catherine Talmadge," she said, and extended her hand before remembering that a lady did not typically offer her hand to a stranger on a dusty road. But David Wilcox took it anyway, his grip calloused and warm and careful, as though he understood without being told that she had already suffered enough handling for one day. "What is it you lost, Miss Talmadge?" "A locket. Silver with my mother's picture inside. It fell when the men were pulling at my bag." David crouched down without another word and began to search the grass alongside her, and for several minutes they worked in silence, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of a meadowlark, until his fingers closed on something small and metallic half buried beneath a fallen leaf. "Is this it?" Catherine took the locket from his palm and felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Wilcox." "David is fine," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, simple and direct, that told her he was not a man who put much stock in formality. "You said the coach is waiting." "Yes, though I imagine Hobbs is growing impatient. I'll ride escort the rest of the way into town if you'll allow it. Those men might still be about, and 3 riders can just as easily become 6 if they've friends waiting." Catherine studied him for a moment, this stranger with the steady eyes and the rifle he had not once pointed at her, and she found herself nodding. "I would be grateful, Mr. Wilcox." "David," he corrected gently, and helped her back up into the stagecoach with a hand at her elbow that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary, though neither of them remarked upon it. He rode alongside the coach the rest of the way into Willow Creek, and Catherine watched him through the small window more than she watched the passing prairie, telling herself it was only prudent to keep an eye on the man who had appointed himself her protector, though she suspected even then that her reasons ran deeper than prudence. Willow Creek was a town of perhaps 400 souls, a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a small white church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east from years of prairie wind, and a land office where Catherine's business awaited her. When the stagecoach finally rolled to a stop before the office, David dismounted and helped her down once more, and this time his hand stayed at her waist a heartbeat longer, steadying her against the sudden solid stillness of the ground after hours of jostling. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Wilcox," she said, straightening her hat, which had gone askew somewhere in the last 6 miles. "David," he said again, and there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You are going to have to get used to saying it eventually, Miss Talmadge, seeing as we are near enough neighbors." "Neighbors." I heard the driver mention Talmadge land when he was talking to the sheriff about the robbery. "That would be old Silas Talmadge's place, would it not? The one bordering my north pasture." "Silas Talmadge was my uncle," Catherine said, feeling a strange lightness settle over her at the coincidence, or perhaps it was not entirely coincidence in a town this small. "I have come to claim what is left of his estate." "Then I suppose we are neighbors indeed," David said, and touched the brim of his hat before swinging back up onto his horse. "I hope you'll forgive me for saying I look forward to it, Miss Talmadge." She watched him ride off down the main street, back toward whatever supplies he had originally come to town to purchase, and she told herself firmly that she had far more pressing matters to attend to than the memory of a stranger's steady hands and easy laugh. The land office, however, held disappointment rather than fortune. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, informed her with visible discomfort that her uncle's estate had been considerably diminished by debts in his final years, that the house itself had fallen into disrepair, and that after settling what was owed, Catherine would inherit little more than 40 acres of scrubland, a leaning barn, and a house with a roof that likely would not survive the coming winter's snow. "There must be some mistake," Catherine said, though even as she spoke the words she knew there was not. "My uncle wrote to my father not 2 years ago describing a prosperous cattle operation." "Your uncle, God rest him, was known to embellish his letters," the clerk said gently. "The truth is, Miss Talmadge, most folks around here expected the bank to take the land outright after his passing. It was only that no one else wanted it badly enough to contest your claim that you have anything at all." Catherine left the land office with the deed clutched in her hand, and a hollow feeling in her chest that she recognized as the particular despair of a woman who has traveled 1,000 miles toward a promise that turned out to be nothing more than dust. She had no money left, her belongings stolen, and now the one thing she had been counting on, the inheritance that was meant to be her foundation for a new life, revealed as little more than a burden of taxes and repairs she had no means to pay. She walked the length of the main street twice before she allowed herself to sit down on the bench outside the mercantile, and it was there, an hour later, with the sun beginning its long slide toward the horizon, that David Wilcox found her again, this time with a wagon loaded with supplies and a look of concern that he did not bother to hide. "Miss Talmadge, you look as though you have received bad news." "I have received the worst sort of news, Mr. Wilcox, which is the news that I have nothing at all, and a mountain of debt besides." She had not meant to say it, had not meant to burden a stranger with her troubles, but the words came tumbling out before she could stop them, and once they started she found she could not seem to hold the rest back either. She told him about the estate, about the debts, about her father's ruined business and her mother's death 2 winters past, and about the long journey west that had promised salvation and delivered only more sorrow. David listened without interrupting, and when she finally fell silent, wrung dry of words, He did not offer the empty condolences she had expected. Instead he said, 40 acres is not nothing, Miss Talmadge. It is a start, and a leaning barn can be straightened with enough good lumber and a willing back. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, but it is not nothing either. He studied her for a long moment, and then he said, I would be glad to ride out with you tomorrow and look over the property if you would allow it. I know a bit about repairing barns, having built 3 of my own. Catherine wanted to refuse, wanted to protect what little pride she had left, but exhaustion and fear won out over pride, and she found herself nodding. I would be grateful, Mr. Wilcox. David, he said for the 3rd time that day, and this time she managed a small, tired smile. David, she echoed, and something in the way he looked at her when she said his name told her that this small victory mattered to him more than he let on. The following morning, David arrived at the boarding house where Catherine had taken a room on credit, promising the proprietress she would settle the bill once she had assessed her uncle's estate, and together they rode out to the Talmadge property in David's wagon, the fall air crisp and gold with the turning of the cottonwood leaves. The land, when they arrived, was every bit as discouraging as the clerk had described. 40 acres of overgrown pasture, a farmhouse with a sagging porch and a roof missing enough shingles to let daylight through in patches, and a barn that leaned so severely to one side that Catherine feared it might collapse if she so much as breathed too heavily near it. It is worse than I imagined, she said, standing in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had little to do with the weather. It has good bones, David said, walking the perimeter of the house with the careful eye of a man assessing what could be salvaged. The foundation is solid stone. The well looks to be in working order, and this land, though it has gone wild, has good soil beneath the weeds. Your uncle knew what he was doing when he chose this parcel, even if he let it slip through his fingers toward the end. What good is good soil to a woman with no money for seed, and no money for lumber, and no money for anything at all? David turned to look at her then, and there was something steady and certain in his gaze that made her breath catch unexpectedly. You have hands, Miss Talmadge, and I am guessing a good deal more determination than you are giving yourself credit for, and you have a neighbor with lumber to spare and time on his hands come the slow season. I could not possibly accept such charity. It would not be charity, he said. It would be neighbors helping neighbors, same as folks have always done out here. You would owe me nothing but perhaps a decent supper now and again, if you can manage to cook on that stove of yours once we get the chimney cleared. Catherine wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that she would not be beholden to any man, but there was something in the plain practicality of his offer, the absence of any expectation beyond simple kindness, that disarmed her objections before she could fully form them. And so it was that over the following weeks, David Wilcox became a fixture on the Talmadge property, arriving most mornings with lumber and tools and an easy patience that never once made Catherine feel like a charity case, even as he straightened her barn, repaired her roof, and taught her the particulars of tending a homestead that her Baltimore upbringing had never prepared her for. It was during those weeks that Catherine came to understand the true measure of David Wilcox, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses, the way he always brought extra nails in case she needed them for some project of her own, the way he taught her to milk the single cow her uncle had left behind without once laughing at her clumsy early attempts, the way he sat with her on the crooked porch steps in the evenings and told her about his own arrival in Kansas 8 years past. A younger brother following an older one out to try their luck at ranching after their parents had died of fever back in Missouri. My brother Thomas and I built this ranch from nothing, David told her one October evening, as the sun set in a wash of orange and purple over the prairie. We had less than you have now, Catherine, if truth be told, 2 horses, a wagon, and enough money for the land claim and not much else besides. What happened to your brother? David's expression clouded briefly, and Catherine immediately regretted the question, seeing the shadow it brought to his face. He is buried on a hill behind my house. Took sick 3 winters back, a fever the doctor could not name, and there was nothing to be done but watch him go. I have run the ranch alone since. I am sorry, David. I should not have asked. No, he said, shaking his head. It does a man good to speak of the ones he has lost now and again. Otherwise the grief just sits in him like a stone, and stones have a way of growing heavier the longer they are carried alone. He looked at her then, and there was something searching in his gaze. You lost your mother, you said, and your father. Passed 6 months after the business failed. I believe the shame of it broke something in him that never mended. Catherine looked out over the darkening prairie, feeling the old grief rise up familiar and sharp. I have no family left, David. No one at all, save whatever distant cousins might still exist back east, and none of them offered so much as a letter when my father died. You have neighbors, David said quietly. That is something out here. Sometimes it is the only something a person needs. It was on one such evening, some 3 weeks after their first meeting on the dusty road, that David finally worked up the courage to ask Catherine to accompany him to the harvest dance that the town held each year at the end of October, a celebration marking the close of the growing season and the gathering in of crops before winter's hard grip settled over the plains. I would be honored, David, Catherine said, and found that she meant it more than she had meant almost anything in the long, difficult months since her world had come apart. The dance was held in the town's largest barn, cleared of hay and strung with lanterns that cast a warm, golden light over the gathered crowd, and Catherine wore the only dress she had left that had not been ruined by the robbery or the dust of the homestead, a simple blue calico that she had mended twice already, but that David told her, with evident sincerity, made her look like the finest lady in the territory. They danced twice, an awkward waltz that neither of them performed with much grace, but that neither of them minded either, laughing more than they moved with proper form. And it was during their second dance that Catherine first allowed herself to fully acknowledge the feeling that had been growing in her chest for weeks. A warmth that had nothing to do with the lanterns or the crowded barn, and everything to do with the steady press of David's hand at her waist, and the way he looked at her as though she were something precious rather than something broken. But the evening was not without its shadows, for it was at the dance that Catherine first encountered Margaret Ashworth, a woman of considerable means whose father owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and who made no secret of her own interest in David Wilcox, an interest that had apparently been building for some time before Catherine's arrival in Willow Creek. Mr. Wilcox, Margaret said, approaching them during a lull in the music, her smile sharp as a blade beneath its polite veneer. You have been keeping company with our new arrival, I see. Miss Ashworth, David said, with a courtesy that Catherine noticed carried none of the warmth he showed toward her. Miss Talmadge, may I introduce Margaret Ashworth? Her father owns the Circle ranch north of town. A pleasure, Catherine said, though Margaret's cool appraisal suggested the feeling was not mutual. I understand you have inherited the old Talmadge place, Margaret said, her gaze flicking over Catherine's mended dress with an assessment that missed nothing. Such a shame about the state of it. My father says it will take a fortune to make that land productive again, more money than most folks around here have to spare. Fortunately, Catherine said, keeping her voice level though her cheeks burned, I have found that hard work counts for a great deal more than fortune when a person is willing to apply themselves. How admirable, Margaret said, in a tone that suggested she found nothing admirable in it at all. Mr. Wilcox, I do hope you will save a dance for me before the evening is through. My father has been asking after you, wondering if you might consider joining our operations, given how well your grazing land would complement ours. I have committed to keeping my ranch independent, Miss Ashworth, as your father well knows, David said. But I would not deny you a dance if the evening allows for it. Margaret departed with a final measuring glance toward Catherine, and once she was out of earshot, Catherine could not help herself. She seems quite determined where you are concerned, David. Margaret Ashworth has been determined about a great many things since her mother passed and left her running that household, David said, with a wry twist to his mouth. Her father has hinted more than once that a union between our two operations would benefit everyone concerned, myself included, but I have never been a man to marry for land, Catherine, no matter how much sense it might make on paper. What would you marry for then? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt her face warm at her own boldness. David's expression grew serious, and for a moment the music and laughter of the dance seemed to fade around them. I would marry for the kind of feeling that makes a man want to build something lasting, Catherine. Not land, not cattle, not what a woman brings with her in trunks and bank accounts. Something truer than that. Catherine did not know what to say to such a declaration, and so she said nothing at all, but she carried his words with her long after the dance had ended, and David had driven her home beneath a sky scattered with more stars than she had ever seen in Baltimore's smoke-hazed nights. The weeks that followed brought the first hints of true winter to the Kansas plains, and with the cold came new challenges to the fragile partnership growing between Catherine and David. The roof repairs held, thanks to David's careful work, but the barn, despite his best efforts, remained a project only half completed when the first snow fell in mid-November, dusting the prairie in white and forcing a temporary halt to outdoor labor. It was during this enforced pause, with David unable to work on the property, and Catherine facing the long, lonely stretch of winter alone in a house still not entirely weather-tight, that the true depth of her feelings for him became impossible to deny any longer. She found herself watching for his wagon on the horizon each day, even when there was no practical reason to expect him, and when illness kept him away for nearly a week in early December, a bout of influenza that swept through the county and laid low half the ranch hands in the area. Catherine surprised herself by riding the 6 miles to his ranch alone, bundled against the cold, to bring him soup and see to his welfare with an urgency that went far beyond mere neighborly concern. She found him abed in his small ranch house, pale and weakened but recovering, tended by an elderly ranch hand named Old Pete, who had worked for the Wilcox brothers since their earliest days in Kansas. David's surprise at seeing her standing in his doorway, snow melting on her shoulders and a pot of soup clutched in her mittened hands, gave way quickly to something warmer, something that made his tired eyes brighten despite his illness. "Catherine," he said, struggling to sit up against his pillows, "you should not have ridden out in this weather, not for my sake." "I could hardly sit idle knowing you were unwell," she said, setting the pot down on the small stove and busying herself with heating it, if only to give her hands something to do besides tremble with the strange mixture of worry and tenderness that had driven her out into the snow. "Old Pete tells me you have had a fever these past 3 days. It is breaking now, I think. I feel more myself today than I have since it started." He watched her as she worked, and when she finally brought him a bowl of the soup and sat beside his bed to help him manage it, given the weakness still lingering in his hands, he said quietly, "You did not need to come, Catherine, but I confess I am glad you did." "Of course I needed to come," she said, and there was an edge of emotion in her voice that surprised even her. "David, I could not bear the thought of you lying here alone, unwell, with no one but Old Pete to look after you. You have been managing your own troubles well enough without my help these past few days," David said gently. "The barn still stands, does it not?" "The barn stands, yes, thanks to your work before you fell ill. But David, that is not the point. I have come to care for you, more than I ever expected when we met on that road, and the thought of anything happening to you, of losing you the way I have lost everyone else who mattered to me, it frightened me more than I know how to say." The words hung in the small room between them, and David set down his spoon and reached for her hand with a strength that belied his recent illness. "Catherine, I have been trying to find the courage to tell you something for weeks now, and perhaps this is not the ideal moment, given that I am pale as a ghost and smell of fever sweat, but I find I cannot wait any longer to say it. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since that first afternoon on the road, when you were more concerned with finding your mother's locket than with the fortune you had just lost. I have never met a woman with such courage, such determination to build something from nothing, and I find that I do not want to face any future, good or bad, without you standing beside me in it." Catherine felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, tears of relief and joy, and something that felt very much like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "David, I love you too. I have loved you for weeks, though I have been too afraid to say it, afraid that I have nothing to offer a man like you, nothing but debts and a half-repaired homestead and a past full of loss." "You have everything to offer," David said fiercely, his grip tightening on her hand. "You have your courage and your kindness, and a laugh that I find myself thinking about at the strangest hours of the day. Catherine Talmadge, I do not care what you do or do not have in the way of money or land. I care about the woman herself, and that woman is more than enough for me." It was some weeks later, once David had fully recovered and the worst of the December cold had settled into a routine of manageable winter chores, that David rode out to the Talmadge homestead on a Sunday afternoon with a particular purpose in mind, one that had been growing in his heart since that feverish confession in his sick room. He found Catherine in the yard, tending to the chickens she had purchased with the last of her meager savings, her breath clouding in the cold air as she scattered feed across the frozen ground. "David," she said, straightening at his approach, a smile breaking across her face that still, after weeks of courtship, made his heart lift in his chest. "I did not expect you until Tuesday." "I could not wait until Tuesday," he said, dismounting and crossing the yard to her, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination that she had not seen on him before. "Catherine, there is something I have come to ask you, and I find myself more nervous asking it than I have been about anything since I was a boy facing down my first stampede." "David, what is it? You are worrying me." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring, simple gold with a modest garnet stone, clearly not an extravagant piece but one that had been chosen with care. "This was my mother's ring, Catherine. It is not much, not the sort of jewel a woman like Margaret Ashworth would find impressive, but it is what I have to offer along with my ranch and my heart and every tomorrow I have left to live. Catherine Talmadge, will you marry me?" Catherine felt the breath leave her lungs entirely, and for a moment she could do nothing but stare at the ring, at the man holding it out to her with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to appear composed. "David, are you certain? I bring you nothing but debts and a house that still needs half its repairs finished and 40 acres of scrubland that has cost you more in lumber and labor than it is likely worth." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," David said. "Catherine, I do not want land or money or any of the things a sensible man is supposed to want from a marriage. I want you, only you. I would rather build a life with a woman who has nothing but her own true heart than with any woman in the territory who came with a fortune attached, but no love to offer alongside it." Catherine felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy this time, unmixed with the grief and fear that had shadowed so much of her recent life. "Yes, David, yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that had finally steadied, and then he kissed her there in the frozen yard, chickens scattering around their feet, the cold forgotten entirely in the warmth of the moment. And Catherine thought that she had never felt so certain of anything as she felt certain in that moment that she had found not just a husband, but a true partner, a man who saw her worth clearly even when the rest of the world saw only what she lacked. News of the engagement spread through Willow Creek, with the speed such news always traveled in small frontier towns, and it was not long before Margaret Ashworth arrived at the Talmadge homestead unannounced, her fine carriage looking distinctly out of place against the still unfinished barn and modest farmhouse. Catherine, surprised by the visit, invited her in with as much grace as she could muster, though she suspected from the tightness around Margaret's mouth that this was not to be a social call of congratulations. Miss Talmadge, Margaret said, once they were seated in Catherine's small parlor, a room still sparse of furniture but kept scrupulously clean. I understand congratulations are in order. Thank you, Miss Ashworth, Catherine said carefully, sensing the tension beneath the pleasantry. I will speak plainly, as I believe you would prefer that to false courtesies. Margaret's gaze swept the modest room, taking in every sign of the family's diminished circumstances with an assessment that missed nothing. You must know that David Wilcox could have had his choice of any woman in this county. My father's ranch alone would have secured his future twice over, and there are other families besides ours who would welcome such a match. Instead, he has chosen you, a woman with nothing, not even a proper roof over her head that does not leak when it rains. David has made his choice, Miss Ashworth, and I do not believe it is one either of us has the right to question. I am not questioning his right to choose. I am warning you, Miss Talmadge, of what such a choice will cost him. A ranch requires capital to grow, to survive the lean years, to weather the droughts and the harsh winters that come with unfortunate regularity on these plains. You bring him nothing but more debts to service, more mouths to feed from land that has not yet proven it can sustain even the family already living upon it. You'll regret choosing a woman with nothing, and worse, he will regret it too, when the hard years come and there is no cushion of wealth to see them through. Catherine felt her spine stiffen, felt the old wound of her family's ruin rise up sharp and painful, but beneath the pain was something new, something forged in the weeks of hard labor and honest partnership she had built with David, a confidence that had not existed in her before she came to Kansas. Miss Ashworth, I understand that you speak from concern for David's welfare, or perhaps from disappointment that your own hopes in that direction have not come to fruition. But I would ask you to consider that a marriage built on land and cattle and bank accounts is no marriage at all if it lacks love. And love, whatever else it may be, is not something that can be purchased or inherited. David has chosen me not despite my circumstances, but because he has seen my character, my willingness to work, my determination to build something worthy even from very little. If that is not enough to weather hard years, then I do not know what wealth alone could possibly provide instead. Margaret's expression flickered, something almost like respect passing briefly across her features before the cool mask returned. You are more determined than I gave you credit for, Miss Talmadge. I hope, for David's sake, that your determination proves equal to the challenges ahead. Good day. After Margaret's carriage had departed down the frozen road, Catherine found herself shaking, though whether from anger or from some lingering fear that Margaret's words had struck closer to truth than she wished to admit, she could not entirely say. When David arrived that evening for their usual visit, she told him of the conversation, watching his face carefully for any sign that Margaret's warnings had planted seeds of doubt. Margaret Ashworth has always believed that a person's worth could be measured in cattle and acreage, David said, his jaw tight with something that Catherine recognized as genuine anger on her behalf. She is wrong, Catherine, and I will tell her so myself if she has the audacity to say such things to you again. You are worth more to me than every acre her father owns, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you will let me. I am not afraid of hard years, David, Catherine said, and found as she spoke the words that she meant them completely. I have already survived losing everything once. I know now that I can survive it again if I must, so long as I do not have to survive it alone. You will never have to survive anything alone again, David said, and pulled her into an embrace that promised, more clearly than any words could have, the truth of that vow. They married in the small white church in Willow Creek on a cold, bright day in January of 1879. With a modest gathering of neighbors and friends who had come to know and respect Catherine during her months in the town, a testament to how thoroughly she had woven herself into the fabric of the community, despite her initial poverty and misfortune. Old Pete stood as David's witness, having become something of a surrogate family member to both of them over the preceding months. And the town's minister, Reverend Caldwell, spoke words over their union that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. Words about love that built rather than love that merely accumulated, about partnerships forged in shared labor and mutual respect rather than convenience or calculation. Margaret Ashworth was notably absent from the ceremony, though her father sent a brief note of formal congratulations that David read with a wry twist of his mouth before setting it aside without comment. Catherine wore a new dress, her first in many months, sewn by the wife of the mercantile owner as a wedding gift, pale cream cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar. And though it was far simpler than anything she might have worn at a Baltimore society wedding, she thought she had never felt more beautiful than she did standing beside David at the altar, his eyes bright with an emotion he did not bother to hide from the gathered witnesses. The years that followed tested the young couple in ways that proved both Margaret's warnings and David's confidence to contain elements of truth. The winter of 1879 brought a harsh blizzard that killed nearly a quarter of David's cattle, a devastating loss that would have crushed a lesser partnership, but that Catherine and David faced together with a grim determination that only deepened their bond. Catherine, drawing on skills she had never expected to need, proved herself an invaluable partner in the recovery, managing the household accounts with a precision that stretched every dollar further than David had believed possible, and even learning to ride out with him during calving season, her Baltimore upbringing giving way entirely to the practical competence of a true rancher's wife. "You never told me you could ride like this," David said one spring morning in 1880, watching with evident admiration as Catherine wheeled her horse expertly around a straying calf, guiding it back toward the herd with a confidence that would have astonished the woman who had first stumbled off a stagecoach 18 months prior. "There is a great deal about me you did not know when you proposed, David Wilcox," Catherine called back, laughing as she brought the calf under control. "Perhaps that is the nature of marriage, discovering all the hidden capabilities a person carries within them, given the right circumstances and the right partner to draw them out. Then I consider myself the most fortunate man in Kansas," David said, "to have married a woman who keeps surprising me year after year." Their combined efforts, David's ranching expertise paired with Catherine's careful management, and her uncle's 40 acres finally brought fully into productive use, gradually transformed both properties into a single thriving operation that by 1882 had grown to rival even the Ashworth Ranch in size and profitability. Though David always insisted that the true measure of their success lay not in acreage or cattle counts, but in the life they had built together. A life rich with love even during the leanest years. It was in the autumn of 1881 that Catherine gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after David's late brother, a fact that brought tears to David's eyes when Catherine suggested it, understanding as she did how deeply the loss of his brother still lived within him even years after the fact. Thomas Wilcox arrived healthy and strong on a crisp October morning, delivered with the assistance of the town midwife and old Pete's wife, who had become close friends with Catherine over the preceding years, and David wept openly holding his newborn son for the first time, tears he made no effort to hide even from the assembled women in the room. "He has your eyes," Catherine said weakly from the bed, exhausted but glowing with a happiness that transcended her fatigue. "He has your stubbornness, I suspect, given how long he took convincing to arrive," David said, laughing through his tears, and the whole room joined in the laughter, a moment of pure joy that Catherine would treasure for the rest of her days. 2 years later, in 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Eleanor after Catherine's mother, and by then the Wilcox Ranch had grown into one of the most respected operations in the county, its success built not on inherited wealth but on the partnership of two people who had faced hardship together and emerged stronger for it. Margaret Ashworth, who had eventually married a banker from Topeka and moved away from Willow Creek entirely, sent a brief but genuinely warm letter of congratulations upon hearing of Alina's birth, a gesture that surprised Catherine, but that she chose to accept in the spirit of reconciliation it seemed to offer, understanding perhaps better than most how disappointment could sharpen a person's tongue in ways they might later come to regret. It was during the spring of 1884, with young Thomas now old enough to toddle after his father through the barn and baby Alina cradled in Catherine's arms during the long evening hours, that David found Catherine sitting on the porch of their now thoroughly repaired farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose, and he sat down beside her with the easy familiarity of 5 years of marriage, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as she leaned into him. "Do you remember what Margaret Ashworth said to you all those years ago?" David asked quietly, "about regretting the choice to marry a woman with nothing." "I remember," Catherine said. "I think of it now and again when I look at all we have built together." "I have never once regretted it," David said. "Not for a single day, not even during the worst of that first winter when we lost so much of the herd, not even when the doubts crept in about whether we would manage to keep the ranch solvent through those early lean years. You were never a woman with nothing, Catherine. You were a woman with everything that truly mattered, courage and kindness, and a heart big enough to love a grieving rancher and help him build something worth building. The land, the cattle, the money, none of that came with you when I married you, but everything that made this life worth living, that came with you entirely." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of a happiness so complete it sometimes still astonished her, given how thoroughly despair had gripped her on that dusty road 5 years past. "And I have never regretted choosing you either, David Wilcox, not for a single moment. You saw something in me that even I did not see in myself, back when I had lost everything and believed myself worthless because of it. You taught me that worth is not measured in what a person possesses, but in what they are willing to build and who they are willing to become, given love and patience and the right partner to walk alongside them." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the sun sink fully below the horizon, the prairie settling into the deep purple hush of evening, their children's voices drifting from inside the house where old Pete's wife, now serving as something of a beloved grandmother figure to the family, was singing them toward sleep. It was a scene of such profound peace and contentment that Catherine found herself marveling, as she often did in quiet moments, at the strange alchemy of fate that had brought her to this particular life, this particular love, out of the ashes of everything she had once believed essential to her happiness. The ranch continued to prosper in the years that followed, and by 1887, the Wilcox family had welcomed a third child, another son they named Silas after Catherine's uncle, whose modest inheritance had proven, despite its initial appearance of worthlessness, to be the very foundation upon which their entire life together had been built. The 40 acres that had once seemed a burden of debt and disrepair had grown, through years of careful cultivation and the addition of David's original ranch, into nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, one of the most successful operations in that part of Kansas, employing a dozen hands and supporting 3 families beyond their own. Old Pete, who had never had children of his own, doted on the Wilcox children as though they were his grandchildren, and when he passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889, having lived to the respectable age of 73, David and Catherine buried him on the same hill behind the original ranch house where David's brother Thomas rested, marking the grave with a stone that read simply, "A true friend and faithful hand," and holding a small memorial service attended by nearly the entire town, a testament to how deeply the old man had woven himself into the community's affection during his long life. It was around this same time, in the early 1890s, that Willow Creek itself began to change, growing from a small cattle town into a more established community as the railroad extended a spur line through the area, bringing new settlers and new opportunities for trade. The Wilcox Ranch benefited considerably from this growth, gaining easier access to markets for their cattle. And David, ever the practical businessman despite his romantic heart, expanded the operation further, eventually adding a small herd of dairy cattle at Catherine's suggestion, recognizing the growing demand for fresh milk and butter among the town's expanding population. Catherine herself became something of a respected figure in Willow Creek's evolving social fabric, known throughout the county for her practical wisdom and her willingness to help other struggling families find their footing, much as David had once helped her. She often thought back to those early days, to the desperation she had felt standing on that dusty road with nothing left to her name, and she made it a point, whenever a new family arrived in similarly reduced circumstances, to offer whatever assistance she could, understanding intimately how far a single act of kindness could travel in shaping a person's future. "You have become quite the pillar of this community," David observed one evening in 1892, watching Catherine return from a visit to a newly arrived widow and her 3 children, having brought them a basket of preserves and a promise of work on the ranch for the eldest son, who had proven himself skilled with horses. "I remember when you first arrived here, so uncertain of your place in the world." "I remember it too," Catherine said, settling onto the porch beside him, their evening ritual little changed despite the years and the additional children who had joined their family. "I think that uncertainty taught me something important, David. It taught me that a person's circumstances at any given moment do not define their ultimate worth or their ultimate potential. I arrived in Willow Creek with nothing, and look what we have built together since." "We built it together," David agreed, "though I confess I sometimes think you deserve the greater share of credit. You brought a determination to this partnership that matched and perhaps exceeded my own." By 1895, their eldest son Thomas had grown into a capable young man of 14, already showing the same steady competence with horses and cattle that his father had possessed at that age, while Eleanor, now 12, had developed into a bright and curious girl who spent her free hours devouring every book she could find, a passion for learning that Catherine encouraged wholeheartedly. Having herself always regretted the limitations placed on women's education, even in her more privileged Baltimore childhood. Young Silas, at 8 years old, remained the most adventurous of the 3 children, forever getting into minor scrapes that kept both his parents perpetually on their toes, though his fundamentally good heart meant that his mischief rarely caused any lasting harm. It was in the autumn of 1896, some 18 years after that first fateful meeting on the dusty Kansas road, that David surprised Catherine with an anniversary gift that spoke to the full circle their lives had traveled since their beginning. He had commissioned a local craftsman to build a small cabinet, and within it, carefully preserved, was the original silver locket that had brought them together on that road so many years before, the one containing her mother's portrait, which Catherine had believed lost forever during the intervening years of moves and renovations, and the general chaos of raising 3 children on a working ranch. "David, how did you find this? I thought it lost years ago, misplaced during one of our moves." "I found it tucked away in an old trunk while clearing out the attic last month," David said, watching her face with evident satisfaction at her joyful surprise. "I thought it fitting, given everything that locket represents about how we met, to have it properly preserved and displayed, rather than lost in some forgotten corner of the house." Catherine held the locket in her hands, running her thumb over its familiar surface, and felt the full weight of gratitude for the life she had built settle over her like a warm embrace. "Do you remember what you said to me, that very first day, when Margaret Ashworth's warnings had not yet even entered our lives?" "I remember most everything about that day," David said. "I remember thinking you were the most determined woman I had ever encountered, kneeling in the dirt searching for a lost locket while 3 armed bandits might still have been lurking somewhere nearby. "You told me that 40 acres was not nothing," Catherine said. "That it was a start." "And it was," David said. "Look at what that start has become, Catherine. 2,000 acres, 3 beautiful children, a ranch that supports a dozen families besides our own, and a marriage that I would not trade for any fortune in the world." "Margaret Ashworth warned me that I would bring you only regret," Catherine said softly. "That you would come to resent choosing a woman with nothing over a woman who could have brought wealth and security to the marriage from its very beginning. And I told her, or rather I told you, that I would regret choosing anyone else far more than I could ever regret choosing you," David said, taking her hands in his, the locket still nestled between their palms. 18 years, Catherine, and I have never once had cause to doubt that choice. You gave me everything that truly matters, love and partnership, and a family built on mutual respect rather than mere convenience. Margaret Ashworth, wherever she is now, could not possibly understand the wealth we have accumulated together, because it is not the kind of wealth that can be measured in bank accounts or cattle counts. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life, marked by the changing seasons, the birth of new calves each spring, the harvest of crops each autumn, and the gradual maturation of their 3 children into capable young adults who each, in their own way, carried forward the values their parents had instilled in them through years of shared labor and love. Thomas eventually took over increasing responsibility for the ranch's daily operations as he grew into manhood, showing a natural aptitude for the business that made David immensely proud, while Eleanor's love of learning led her, with her parents' full support and financial backing, that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate months of Catherine's arrival in Kansas, to attend a teacher's college in Topeka, eventually returning to Willow Creek to establish herself as the town's most beloved schoolteacher. Young Silas, true to his adventurous nature, eventually struck out on his own in his early 20s, using his share of the family's accumulated wealth to establish a horse breeding operation some 50 miles distant, a venture that David had initially worried might fail given his youngest son's tendency toward impulsiveness, but that ultimately succeeded through the same combination of determination and heart that had characterized his parents' original partnership. It was in the spring of 1903, with Catherine now 45 years old and David approaching 50, that the couple celebrated the wedding of their eldest son Thomas to a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a ceremony that brought the full circle of their community together in celebration, much as their own wedding had done a quarter-century before. Standing at the edge of the celebration, watching their son dance with his new bride beneath strings of lanterns not unlike those that had illuminated their own courtship dance so many years before, Catherine found herself overwhelmed with a profound sense of gratitude for the life she had been given, a life that had begun in such desperate uncertainty and had grown, through years of shared labor and unwavering love, into something rich beyond her wildest early imaginings. "Do you have any regrets, David?" Catherine asked, as they stood together watching their son's celebration, the question arising not from doubt but from a genuine curiosity about how he viewed the full sweep of their years together. "Only one," David said, and when Catherine turned to him with sudden concern, he smiled and continued, "I regret that I did not find you sooner, Catherine. I regret all those years before you arrived in Kansas, years I spent building a ranch alone without knowing that my true purpose, my true happiness, was still waiting for me on some dusty road I had not yet traveled. I think we found each other exactly when we were meant to," Catherine said. "I do not believe I would have appreciated you fully, David, had we met at any other point in my life. I needed to lose everything first, to understand truly what it means to build something from nothing, alongside a partner who values character over circumstance." They danced together that evening, as they had danced at their own wedding and at countless celebrations in the years between, moving with the easy familiarity of two people who had learned every rhythm of each other's hearts through decades of shared joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship. And as they danced, David leaned down to whisper in Catherine's ear the same sentiment he had expressed so many years before, on that cold January day when he had proposed with his mother's simple ring, and a heart full of certainty that no fortune could have improved upon. "I would choose you again, Catherine Talmadge Wilcox, in every life, in every circumstance, poor or wealthy, easy or difficult. You were never a woman with nothing. You were always the woman who had everything I needed." Catherine felt tears rise to her eyes, tears of joy rather than sorrow, tears that marked not an ending but a continuation of the love that had sustained them through every season of their shared life. "And I would choose you again as well, David Wilcox, 1,000 times over, in every life, in every circumstance. You saw worth in me when I could not see it in myself, and you have spent every day since proving that your faith in me was not misplaced." They grew old together on that ranch, watching their children build their own families, welcoming grandchildren into the world with the same joy that had marked the births of their own 3 children, and continuing to sit together on that same porch each evening, watching the Kansas sunset paint the sky in colors that never grew old no matter how many times they witnessed the display. The ranch that had begun as 40 acres of debt and disrepair had grown, through their combined efforts and the efforts of the children who inherited their work ethic and their capacity for love, into a legacy that would sustain generations of Wilcox descendants for decades to come, a testament to the truth that David had recognized in Catherine from their very first meeting, that a person's worth could never be measured merely by what they possessed, but only by the strength of character they brought to building whatever future lay before them. Margaret Ashworth, in her later years, having achieved considerable wealth and social standing through her marriage to the Topeka banker, occasionally corresponded with Catherine, their early rivalry having softened over the decades into something approaching genuine friendship, born of the shared experience of building lives on the frontier, and watching those lives unfold in ways neither of them could have fully predicted in their younger years. In one of her final letters, written not long before her death in 1908, Margaret acknowledged with unexpected grace the error of her early warnings. "I confess, Catherine," she wrote, "that I misjudged the nature of true wealth all those years ago. I believed that security and comfort could only spring from inherited fortune, and I did not understand, as you and David so clearly understood even in your earliest days together, that the truest security comes from a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. I have watched from a distance as your family has flourished, and I recognize now that you possessed, even in your poverty, riches that I did not fully appreciate until much later in my own life. I wish you continued happiness, and I thank you for showing me, through your example, a wisdom about love and worth that I was slow to learn myself." Catherine wept upon reading this letter, moved not by vindication, but by genuine compassion for a woman who had spent so many years believing in a narrower definition of value than the one she and David had discovered together on that Kansas prairie. She wrote back a warm reply, thanking Margaret for her honesty and wishing her peace in her final years, and the correspondence, though it ended with Margaret's passing shortly thereafter, remained a testament to how thoroughly time and experience could soften even the sharpest early judgments. In 1910, on the occasion of their 32nd wedding anniversary, David and Catherine hosted a gathering that brought together 3 generations of their family, children and grandchildren filling the now much expanded farmhouse with laughter and life, a scene that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that desperate day, when Catherine had first arrived in Willow Creek with nothing but a stolen dream and a locket containing her mother's picture. Thomas, now himself a father of 2, had taken over full management of the ranch, allowing David more time to pursue the quieter pleasures of his later years, fishing in the creek that gave the town its name, teaching his grandchildren to ride, and simply sitting on that beloved porch with Catherine, watching the sunsets that had witnessed so much of their shared history. Eleanor, still teaching at the Willow Creek schoolhouse and now married to the town's doctor, brought her own 2 children to the gathering, filling the house with the particular chaos and joy that only grandchildren can provide, while Silas traveled in from his horse ranch with his wife and 3 children, the family reunion representing the full flowering of everything Catherine and David had built together over 3 decades of partnership. 32 years, David said, raising a glass of the mercantile owner's finest brandy in a toast during the celebration, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man surveying a life well lived. 32 years since I met the most stubborn, most determined, most remarkable woman I have ever known, kneeling in the dirt of a Kansas road, searching for a locket that meant more to her than any fortune could have. I told her that day that 40 acres was not nothing, that it was a start. I did not know then just how far that start would carry us, but I knew, even in that first hour, that I had found something worth building a life around. To Catherine, the assembled family called out, raising their own glasses, and Catherine felt the full weight of gratitude and joy that comes from a life fully lived, fully loved, fully realized in ways she could never have imagined during those early desperate days of loss and uncertainty. To David, she responded, raising her own glass toward the man who had seen her worth when the world around her had counted her as having nothing at all, and who had spent 32 years proving, through unwavering love and steadfast partnership, that his faith in her had been the truest investment either of them had ever made. As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing filling the farmhouse that had grown from a leaning, roof-damaged structure into a warm and welcoming family home, Catherine found a quiet moment to step outside onto the porch, seeking a brief respite from the joyful chaos to simply breathe in the familiar Kansas air and reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. David joined her a few minutes later, settling beside her with the ease of decades of shared silences, and together they watched the stars emerge over the prairie, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children, and now the gathering of their grandchildren. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Catherine asked, "when you found me searching for that locket, and you told me you would ride escort for the rest of the way into town?" "I think about it often," David said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders with the familiar warmth of 32 years of marriage. "I think about how close I came to simply riding past, to leaving the search to Hobbs and the other passengers, and how different my life would have been had I made that choice instead." "I am glad you did not ride past," Catherine said softly. "So am I, Catherine. So am I, more than I could ever fully express." He pressed a kiss to her temple, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars, listening to the distant sounds of their family's celebration drifting from the house behind them. 2 people who had built a life together from nothing but determination and love, and who had discovered, through 3 decades of shared labor and shared joy, that such a foundation had proven richer than any inheritance either of them could have imagined on that dusty Kansas road so many years before. They lived out their remaining years in that same contentment, watching their grandchildren grow, watching the ranch continue to flourish under Thomas's capable management, watching Eleanor's own children benefit from the educational opportunities she had fought so hard to establish in the growing town of Willow Creek, and watching Silas's horse breeding operation become renowned throughout the region for the quality of its stock. David passed peacefully in his sleep in 1919, at the age of 72, having lived long enough to see his eldest grandchild married and to hold his first great-grandchild in his arms, a moment of joy that he had described to Catherine in his final weeks as the perfect capstone to a life he considered blessed beyond measure. Catherine survived him by 6 years, spending her final days surrounded by the family they had built together, telling and retelling the story of that first meeting on the dusty road to each new generation of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ensuring that the memory of David Wilcox and the love story that had begun with a lost locket and a stranger's kindness would continue to inspire the family for generations to come. She was buried beside David on that same hill behind their original ranch house, alongside his brother Thomas and their old friend Pete, a peaceful resting place overlooking the land they had transformed together from 40 acres of debt and disrepair into a legacy of love, partnership, and quiet, hard-won prosperity. The headstone that marked their shared grave, commissioned by Thomas according to his parents' final wishes, bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of everything they had built together. Here rest David and Catherine Wilcox, who proved that true wealth is measured not in what we possess, but in the love we choose to build together. It was a fitting tribute to a love story that had begun with a warning meant to discourage, and had ended, 3 decades later, as an enduring testament to the truth that David had recognized from their very first meeting, that a woman with nothing but her own true heart could offer riches far beyond anything mere fortune could provide, and that choosing love over convenience, character over circumstance, would prove, in the end, to be the wisest choice a man could ever make.